we have a problem in this country. This notion of sexy is a really big deal. We're inundated with these sexualized images all the time, but when it comes to actually talking about sex, we don't. We don't even know what it is. I mean, I looked up a definition of sex for this talk, and sex is defined as the act of engaging in sex. I didn't know what to do with that. So I thought we should start there. If we're gonna have pragmatic discussions about sex, we should have a pragmatic definition of sex. And this is important because for human beings, sex is way more than a mechanism of procreation. Sex is a consensual act between one or more people involving stimulation of the vagina, vulva, clitoris, penis, testicles, or anus for the purpose of pleasure and social and emotional connectedness. We are all, by nature of being human, sexual beings. No matter what sex acts we are capable of or choose to engage in, we're sexual beings. And most of us do have sex, if you're using that definition, right? I'm gonna tell you a story about my parents. It explains a lot. Both of my parents are cancer survivors. I was up visiting them earlier this year for my mom's birthday, and she had just gone through a really nasty round of chemotherapy, and she was shaking from the effort that it took for her to get into the car. And my dad turns to her and he says, "I know, baby, I know, you shaking for it. You need it bad. But the kids are in the car. Can you wait till we get home?" That's the reason I'm a sex therapist. But most importantly, it really illustrates how we can own and embrace our sexual selves no matter what the circumstances. How often do you see it handled with that kind of grace and humor and openness? How often do you see sex used as a bridge to connection instead of a place of disconnection? If the primary purpose of sex is pleasure and connectedness, then why are we so quiet about our wants and our needs and our desires? When I started exploring this notion of sex and silence, I found this common emotional thread to the stories that I was hearing. And it was shame. And that made so much sense to me. I really think that shame is the most powerful human emotion. So much of what we do comes from a place of trying to avoid feelings of shame. Now, Brené Brown, who is my TED Talk superhero, defines shame in relation to guilt. She states, "Guilt is I made a mistake, and shame is I am a mistake." So many of our sexual experiences have enormous amounts of shame attached to them, which in turn makes sex a place of disconnection in relationships. So I share this theory with my clients, and I ask them, are they experiencing shame? And people start to sob. Shame is so powerful and so pervasive and takes away so much of our power to connect. How do we get our power back? Paulo Freire wrote that education is cultural action for freedom. Now, he spent decades of his career looking at how cultures of silence are created, and he advocated that the only mechanism truly available to give people their voice back is education. He was talking about adult literacy, not sex ed, I know that. But if he were alive today, I think he'd be okay with me cribbing his ideas for my therapeutic agenda. Because when we are shamed into silence, we don't feel safe in learning what our needs are and our wants are and our desires are and how to meet them. So my mission is to give people their voice back, have them take their power back, and have better sex lives because of it. And I do this by having pragmatic discussions about the barriers they're facing and having the sex that they want and how to negotiate past those barriers. And we may not always get everything we want in bed, but wanting it does not make you a mistake. And it's amazing how much open communication does help us get what we want. People ask me, so what do you do in your sessions? I talk about a lot of stuff. I talk about kegels, and I talk about lubricant, and I talk about sex toys, and I talk about books, and I talk about movies, and I talk about ways of opening up and making sex fun again. But of all the things I explore with clients, I think the most important is this notion of touch. Human beings are hardwired to connect, and the primary mechanism for doing so is touch. My mom was born in 1949, and she only weighed a pound. Babies born in 1949 who only weighed a pound, they didn't live very long. They were put in incubators. Doctors tried to keep them safe from germs and disease, and hoped and prayed that they would survive and thrive. And they usually didn't. Now, my great aunt didn't have any children of her own, but she thought this was the stupidest thing that she had ever heard. She made friends with the nurses. She drove to the hospital every day, and she convinced them to let her take this teeny tiny 1-pound baby out of the incubator and hold her and cuddle her. And my mom surprised everybody by living. And she always felt closer to her aunt than she did her own parents. We build our relationships through touch. Now, Ashley Montague read a really cool book called Touching, The Human Significance of Skin. And she says that sex is the highest form of touch. When we have some kind of barrier in our sexual relationships, one person feels pressured, one feels rejected, and we stop touching each other. I had a friend tell me recently that's when he knew his marriage was over, when his wife wouldn't let him touch her anymore for any reason. This is what we do. We take that barrier, that point of contention in the sexual relationship off the table. It can be renegotiated at another point, but I ask people to re-engage using sensate touch exercises. Now, I have handouts that I give on these. They're not a big secret. You can do a Google search for sensate touch or sensate focus. In fact, I strongly suggest that you do, just saying. But the important thing is we stop shaming and we start reconnecting. And what we thought were big problems become so much smaller. Sometimes they're renegotiated. Sometimes we realize that they just didn't matter to begin with. Now, when I was mapping out this talk, I really had to think about my big idea. That's what TEDx is about, right? These big ideas worth sharing. And all these people are up on this stage talking about things that have the capacity to change the world. And here is Dr. Faith saying, I want you to touch each other. And I want you to talk to each other, and I want you to have better sex. And that's really simple. Here's the thing. Simple is hard. Pushing past shame is so hard. This may be the simplest idea that you hear about today, but that does not make it easy. There's a Choctaw word, ayamida. Loosely translates, it means to be bold or to be courageous. And that's something else that I realized when I was mapping out this talk, that it's not about shame or sex or silence. It is about courage. Now, I knew if I was going to be inviting you to have pragmatic discussions about sex, I had to do the same thing up on this stage. So I started with that pragmatic definition of sex. Now, the minute the word vagina came out of my mouth, some of y'all may have felt a little uncomfortable and maybe didn't even hear anything else I had to say because of it. But I thought that it was important because it's part of my bigger message. And that might have been a small act of courage, but it's not big courage. You know what big courage is? Facing sexual shame head on and reconnecting to the people that you care about. That's an act of ayamida. Asking for what you want. Asking even if you don't know if you're going to get it. Asking because it's important. Asking because it's part of who you are as a sexual being. If you go home and you have these conversations with your loved ones, then we have done something just as important, just as bold, and just as courageous as saving the world. Because all of these big ideas are really just about ways of saving ourselves. Thank you.